Do you know, I can't remember a week in politics like this one. A week so overcast by the threat and then the reality of the new world of tariffs and the disruption to the familiar global trading system. One economist told me it was the biggest self-inflicted shock to the world economy since the Second World War. I'm joined now for my weekly panel by Dominic, Penna, political correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, and Sascha O'Sullivan, host of the Westminster Insider podcast for Politico. Sascha, let me start with you. We haven't seen tariffs at this rate, at this scale in America since 1910. It does really feel like a different world this evening.
It absolutely does. And everyone who I think either stayed up late last night in Europe or woke up early this morning to the news had a similar reaction to what you just said, that the world has changed. And I think, both in London and across Europe, the kind of top minds are trying to figure out what's the impact of retaliatory tariffs. Gosh, that's a hard word to get your mouth around. And how, and does that in fact escalate a very difficult situation? And here in London, the question shifted almost in the space of 6 hours from a message saying we have to keep calm, we're going to keep negotiating, cool heads will prevail.
Nothing to see here.
To you know what? We're going to have to draw up a list of things that we, might put tariffs on. And that was a big change in a very short space of time.
I thought it was extraordinary. Ellie Reeves didn't think it was extraordinary that there'd be much change. Dominic, let's just think a bit about the way that Trump presented all of this, because among many other things, he is a great communicator. And I thought his so-called speech in the Rose Garden was more like old-fashioned music hall than modern communication, and maybe not the worse for it.
Absolutely. The way that Donald Trump presented this was very much as almost a cabaret, a novelty-style approach. He had his giant table of tariffs country by country. It looked like the Eurovision results board that they put up with all the different countries and all their different numbers. And even as he was going, he was saying things like, whoa, Cambodia, 97%. Trump loves the theatricality of it.
He does.
And we could not have a greater contrast between the loyally rather leading Keir Starmer in Downing Street, has always seen politics and the institutions as a very serious business. Now in this very unlikely special relationship with Donald Trump, who, for good or ill, comes across as a showman and is delighted to do so.
Absolutely. And in a way, Sascha, it puts the rest of us in our place. He was almost like the kind of school teacher reading out the end of term results. Cambodia done rather badly, I'm afraid, Cambodia. And so on. We're laughing about it. Of course, it's an incredibly serious story, but he does present it with an enormous elan in a way that the entire world will have been watching and noting.
I don't know about your school results, Andrew. Mine was sparkling.
I was UK. I was 10%. I was only 10%.
But yes, you're right. We are laughing, and there is a kind of element of humour to it and a theatre to it, as Dominic said. But it's incredibly serious. We're talking about the potential for 1.5 trillion shock to the global economy. That's a huge number. When we think about budgets and headrooms and things like that, we're talking in the maybe 5, maybe 10 billion scheme. This is something that will make everyone wake up and think, okay, how do we trade? And it's not, a question of free trade deals. It's, what Donald Trump and his various people were out there saying, this is what's fair. This is, a question of, we will do to you what they feel has been done to them. And,
Absolutely.
A lot of the numbers
he
that
used
they...
very, very lurid language about the way he thought America had been treated. Dominic, when we look at what might happen next, clearly the British government is still trying to negotiate privately something which might mean the end of our digital services tax, might mean, a new approach to chlorinated chicken. Who knows? But when you look at what's happened today to the dollar down and the American markets down, and the prospects for American inflation right up, it may be, I guess, that it's domestic pressure on Trump which changes the story.
Absolutely. And it is remarkable that Trump is going ahead with all of this, knowing, and the people around him will be knowing, that it will hit American consumers. Tariffs are not a one-way street. Tariffs, in effect, will amount to a tax on Americans. But this is another example of the strongman mentality that characterised so much of Trump's first term. It is certainly already characterising his second. This feels like Trump on steroids.
Absolutely. Sascha, I would like to talk also about our relations with Europe in all of this, because on the one hand, if our tariffs are 10%, and the EU are facing 20% tariffs, you can see that some European countries might decide to relocate to the UK in order to export more cheaply and effectively to the US. But that, in turn, would make our relations with the EU, at a time when we're all trying to get together the coalition, the willing over Ukraine, even harder. It is another conundrum for Keir Starmer.
Absolutely. And there is this kind of weird benefit to the UK where they have the potential to actually lure business over but not look like they're doing it, because that would look like they're doing it at the expense of the EU, which they absolutely would be. And then there's the even more complicated question of what happens to Northern Ireland as a result of the Windsor Framework, and do they get dragged into the EU tariffs? It sure looks like they might.
That's extraordinary. I tried to get Ellie Reeves, who was on earlier on, to say that this was a Brexit dividend. She wouldn't.
It's funny that. I mean, we have waited. If this is our first Brexit dividend, we've waited a little bit of time.
Dominic.
Yes, there is this irony in Sir Keir Starmer having been such a great proponent of a second referendum, I think voting in the Commons around 40 times or so to block or delay or obstruct Brexit in some form. And yet, just as earlier in this week, Starmer, the former chief prosecutor, unexpectedly at war with the Sentencing Council, you imagine that he, almost again, unexpectedly thanking his lucky stars for Brexit, because that does seem to be something that means we are paying half of what the EU will be paying.
I think this is beginning to be less a conventional Labour government than a government of national crisis of some kind. I don't know if either of you would agree with that.
I think so. I think, we've been facing quite a few national crises, not just in the Labour government. It's a kind of,
It's a long story.
It's a peril of living in a very difficult and complicated geopolitical situation. This is something that I've been talking about a lot in the last couple of weeks, looking at Ukraine specifically, but it kind of applies to the Trump stuff as well, in the sense of we've been living with and psychologically used to a peace dividend for a very long time. And that applies as much to actual warfare in Ukraine as trade warfare of the kind that we're seeing with the US. And, I think it's really interesting, actually, how people in the US view Britain, because they do actually view it very distinctly from the European Union. And in a sense, that does give us some leverage.
We are in a different place. And let's be fair, Dominic, Keir Starmer has done very, very well, not just with the famous interview with Trump in the White House, but all the telephone calls that have been going on before and since.
Absolutely, and Downing Street very much believe that this vindicates their approach, that now famous letter from the King, which for an untheatrical politician was a moment of superb political theatre from Sir Keir Starmer, rattled a lot of his own Labour MPs and supporters, but Starmer, like I think all world leaders except Trump, is getting used to politics on fast forward. We could well wake up to a different world tomorrow as we did today.